Today, we're going to take a look at the original Zaku. Alright, it's not exactly the original, but it is the first high-grade Zaku II, at least in terms of molds. In 2022, it's definitely not the best Zaku kit out there, but compared to what came before, it is a major improvement. That being said, let's see how well this kit holds up. Unsurprisingly, a lot of things are in two halves, which isn't a big deal for me, at least on the arms and legs, but I can see how this may be a problem since the Zaku has a lot of curved surfaces. The body is in two halves like the old first grade Zaku, which I'm not a fan of since it means no waist articulation even from side to side. Now there isn't much articulation in general, but the part I think feels it the most is the ankles, which have this weird double joint where it could have been a simple ball joint. This makes it a bit awkward to stand even in a neutral position, especially since the feet and ankle armor are molded together as one piece. I've also found that a lot of parts are loose and just fall off, although it's probably because this kit is from 2003 and the mold has been used for a lot. Now this is the Zaku behind all of those collaborations Bandai does, from sports teams to Toyota to fashion brands and even food companies. Seriously, this kit has put in a lot of work. But it really shows his age, and I'm glad we got a revive in 2020. Let's talk about adding a Monoeye. Now this method is very simple, and you already have everything you need to do it. Now adding your own Monoeye really upgrades an older kit like this, and even some of the newer kits like the Origin Zakus, which still have a sticker for the Monoeye. First I sand the kit part just enough so I have a bit of a flat surface. I'm making sure to sand from multiple directions so the Monoeye will sit straight and perpendicular instead of at some angle. And all the Monoeye is a piece of runner that I've cut off and I've just glued to the kit part that I've sanded down. Now it depends on your kit, but as a general guideline you shouldn't glue the runner to the exact midpoint of the kit part since a bit of the bottom is covered. I found out that this is mainly for the Origin Zaku since much more of the kit Monoeye part is exposed, and I have made this mistake in the past. And after everything is dry, you just cut and sand it down until you're happy with how it looks. Of course, I don't have an exact measurement since I just sand it down until I think it personally looks right. And this will be different from kit to kit and even from mobile suit to mobile suit. Here's how it looks. I'm glad it turned out well, especially since this is my first time working on this specific Zaku kit. That being said, not all runners have the same diameter, so it should be pretty easy to find a slightly larger or smaller size based on your preferences and kit dimension. The Zaku has been primed with Mr. Surfacer, and I thought that for today's video, I'd try to make it look like a statue. I did some testing before, and on those tests, I used a dark gray base coat, but I think I'll be keeping this lighter gray. I'm using Mr. Surfacer from the jar and just applying it with a sponge brush so I can get some texture. And because Mr. Surfacer is a liquid putty, it will help fill any seam lines I wasn't able to, helps cover any mistakes I made while priming, and makes any joins in the plastic just a little bit more uniform. Because my jar of Surfacer is at least 6 years old, I thinned it out a bit with Mr. Leveling Thinner. And if you happen to use this stuff, make sure you wear protection and work in a well ventilated area. This stuff is really nasty, make sure to be careful if you're using it. But if you don't want to deal with harmful solvents or if your workspace is completely enclosed, just paint a gray color you like with a sponge brush. You can still get texture this way even without Surfacer, but it won't be as evident. You may also need to go over things with a normal paintbrush, especially in the recessed details if you want a uniform coat, but acrylic dries quickly anyways, so it'll be pretty light work. I like the texture the Surfacer added, but it also tore off chunks of the sponge, so I did sand those bits down with some 400 grit sandpaper. I'm trying to be as light as possible so I don't sand down to the bare plastic, and after sanding, I do go back with the Surfacer again to just reintroduce some texture in places I think it's a bit light. Now I'll be doing some speckling with some different shades of gray. Now in my previous tests, I only used 2 shades of gray. A really dark one which was almost black, and a really light one which looked almost white. But since the Zaku is on the lighter side, I think I should be able to work in a few more shades. I think I used about 4 or 5. Now I don't really think there's any real order to which gray I use since I want this to look pretty random. There really isn't a lot to speckling, but there are a few things to keep an eye out for. The first is paint consistency. Now it may seem obvious, but how thin your paint is and how wet your brush is will greatly affect the size of your specks. Thicker paint tends to stay in the brush and will leave finer specks, while thinner paint travels further and creates bigger ones. I wish I had a definite ratio to give you all, but it honestly comes down to the paint you're using and even from bottle to bottle, since paint can get a little weird depending on how long it's been sitting. Because I like finer specs and this is 1 to 1/44 scale, I only introduce water to my paint after I clean my brush and load paint onto it. A thicker paint also introduces texture, which helps build the impression even more that the Zaku is a stone statue. Now the second thing to watch out for is how your brush is positioned, not only in terms of distance from the model, but also in terms of the angle it's at. I keep the brush pretty close, maybe around 2 or 3 inches from the model's surface, and I try keeping the brush more or less parallel to the model. Now this means I have to wait for things to dry and move the model around more, but it really helps me be patient with the step. I wanted my specs to be generally circular and not along the lines of splashed mud, so I do take my time with this. The third, of course, is the type of brush you use. I haven't done that many tests, admittedly, comparing how different brushes create different speckling effects, but I'm sure you can imagine that a really stiff brush has different properties than one that isn't as stiff. You do generally want a stiff brush for speckling since it has a bit of spring to it and it'll actually get your paint to travel. But I'm not perfect, and I do end up with slightly larger specs in some places than I'd like. But that being said, in this scale you have to figure out a compromise between realism and an effect which will actually be seen. Now that I'm done with the speckling, I'm using a light gray wash, not only to show off the kit details, but as a filter and a general patina. It helps to even out the lightest grays and makes the model seem a bit older. When applying this wash, I generally try and do vertical motions with my brush to simulate the effects of gravity, but that is, after all, only a general guideline that I don't really follow myself. My main goal is to get as much of this on and to cover the entire surface of the model. I will do vertical motions, but I do circular and tapping ones as well, since a bit of randomness is always nice in my opinion. And when that's dry, I'll give everything a coat of flat clear. This of course protects the painted surface, but it also makes the model feel a bit chalky, which adds to the effect that I want to achieve. Our Zaku is done, and this is a nice simple paint job which works well with the older high-grade kits. That being said, I found this to be a bit too simple, so let's do something about that. I found this wooden cube laying around and thought it would work perfectly for a base. I want this base to be something simple, so I'm thinking a sculpture garden. I was looking at pictures online, and the majority of sculpture gardens I saw were just a grassy area for the sculptures and a paved area for people. The path is just some sheet styrene with some texturing, and the groundwork is actually supposed to be for desert sand, but I wanted to use what I already had laying around, and it'll get painted anyways. I did sand down the sand product after it dried for a bit because I wanted the Zaku to stand evenly, which is pretty important since I'm not permanently attaching it to the base. And now we're just painting the sandy area, starting off with a dark brown and then working in a lighter one afterwards, just so there can be some basic highlights and shadows. I'm choosing to keep things very simple, mainly because it'll be covered up with grass anyways. And when the paint is dry, I use some pigments to get a final color I like, as well as to blend the path with the earth. I sealed everything with a light coat of flat clear, and I'm starting to add grass. Now this is meant for wargaming miniatures, and I think it's the right size for what I've got going on. It visually reads as grass without being too big, it's just the right size. I think this is static grass, which I don't have an applicator for, but I got some of it to stand upwards when I turned the base upside down and tapped off the excess. I'm adding some figures to give the scene a bit more life and add a sense of scale to the Zaku. Now these are actually meant for railroad and architectural models, so they may not be exactly 1 to 1/44 scale, but they're close enough. I had 2 varieties of figures, unpainted and painted, but I chose the painted ones. The painting isn't the best, but I am repainting them and I can just use the colored parts as a guide for my own, which helps since they are so tiny. Now, I decided that the figures nearest to the Zaku would be the brightest, and the colors would become less and less vibrant as we go outwards in the base. And I knew for this woman I wanted red. I only really paint the dress because she's standing in the grass, and I really like how the red looks. Moving outwards, we're using blue and brown. They still make the figure stand out from the base, but I chose colors which were a bit on the muted side. For the last figure, I wanted him to blend really well with the base, to almost disappear, so I'm using a very pale gray for this. I originally thought about using a gray so he would blend into the base even further, but I wanted him to just subtly stand out, and the pale green worked well. And for the final touch, I added in some grass tufts. They added a bit of contrast to the existing grass work, and they also sort of helped to frame out the edges of the base. And here's the finished product. Now this is a little different from what I usually do, but I really liked working on this project. It's always nice to do something a bit different. Now I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing the next video, whenever that is.